In this module, we're going to be diving deep on the third part of our growth process, experiments. In the last lesson, we talked a little bit about why experiments are so important. The first thing is that they help us avoid the typical human biases of overestimating the probability of something being successful, then overestimating its potential, and then inflating its success in hindsight. In other words, experiments helps us get to the truth behind our growth model and our user psychology map, the two tools that we use to navigate ourselves towards growth initiatives that have large impact on our product and our business. But there's a lot of different traps around experiments and common misunderstandings that we need to go through first. The first common misunderstanding is viewing the purpose of experiments as a way to ruthlessly optimize a metric. We view experiments instead as a way to improve the product, knowing that if we improve the product, it will show up in the numbers and improve the metrics along the way. The reason we don't view the purpose of experiments as ruthlessly optimizing a metric is that leads us to viewing things on a short-term basis and short-term gains and local optimization. So once again, we view the purpose of experiments as looking for ways to improve the product and identify the truth within our growth model and user psychology map. And as we improve the product, we know that it's going to show up and improve those metrics along the way. The second common misunderstanding is looking at hypotheses, a key component of experiments, as guesses of how things will perform. Hypotheses are not guesses of how things perform. They're instead a statement, a testable answer to a problem or a question. We focus a lot on developing great hypotheses because clear hypotheses give us clear learnings. They provide a few different things. The first is that they give us structure around our thinking in a methodical way. The second thing is that it gives us something to compare the result of the experiment against. We understand what we're trying to test, compare it against it to understand the delta, which helps us extract learnings. And then the third thing is that it informs valid experiment design, which is a key to extracting learnings. So once again, a hypothesis is a statement, and it's important that we develop clear hypotheses because clear hypotheses give us clear learnings. The third common misunderstanding is that tests should always be the easiest or fastest thing to implement. What we'll talk about when we define different minimum viable tests is that it's more important to understand what are the different variations we can do and what are the trade-offs. We can discuss those with the team to understand what is the best version of an experiment that we can run. The fourth common misunderstanding is that experiments are cheap, so we should always run them. In other words, viewing experiments as an insurance policy for the lack of thinking through all of our problems and what we're trying to do in a structured and critical way. Sometimes if we can't make a decision, we often just default to just using experiments as the answer, but experiments can be expensive. We need to think about the resources to implement them, the iteration that is required to get them to be valid, the time it takes to run them, and then of course going through the analysis process. So once again, we need to be using experiments as a tool to answer and solve the right problems. The fifth common misunderstanding is that analysis around experiments ends with just looking at the success and failure. What we'll talk through is that analysis is actually three different levels. We start with success and failure, but then we need to assess the accuracy of our predictions, and then we need to understand why. Why did we see what we saw within the experiment results in order to understand the potential reasons and the potential learnings that we then want to feed back into our system in our growth model in user psychology. So these are the five common misunderstandings that the purpose of experiments is to optimize a metric. Hypotheses are guesses of how things will perform. Tests should always be the easiest or fastest thing to implement. Experiments are cheap, so we should always run them. And analysis ends with success and failure. Throughout this module, we'll be talking about how to avoid all of these common misunderstandings and the right way to construct and run experiments. We need to break this step of our growth process down into more gradual pieces. Running experiments actually comes down to four specific pieces. The first is defining well-structured hypotheses around key problems. The second is how we define minimum viable tests that are both efficient and valid. The third is how we prioritize all of the minimum viable tests that we come up with. And finally, the fourth is how we analyze experiment results to extract the maximum amount of learnings. So in this module, in the next section, we'll be diving deep on that first part, developing hypotheses, starting with the problem and then breaking it down into different hypotheses. In the section following that, we'll talk about how do we define and prioritize all of the different minimum viable tests that we come up with. And then we'll end with how we analyze and communicate all of our experiment learnings along the way. As we go throughout this module, we'll be using a key tool that you can use within your organization, which is the experiment map. We'll be using the video hosting product Zoom as an example as we go along the way. In the next section and lesson, we're going to kick off how we start thinking about developing clear and well-structured hypotheses.